So let's talk about Calvinism. It's one of those topics in theology that gets people really fired up. It's famous, maybe a little infamous, and it sparks a ton of debate. In this explainer, we're going to dive right into the source material and try to demystify what it's all actually about.
You've probably heard this one before, right? It's the classic caricature, the go-to stereotype. This idea of cold, detached believers, it's just so widespread. And that's exactly why we're starting here, by tackling that myth head-on.
Hey, it doesn't stop with the chosen frozen. The list of complaints is pretty long. People assume it kills any desire to share your faith, that it's all just dry intellectual stuff with no real passion, that it makes people lazy and, ultimately leads to a pretty joyless life. These are really powerful and super common critiques.
But is that really what's going on? The source material suggests that maybe, just maybe, this is a classic case of mistaken identity. The argument is that critics are often looking at the extremes, like hyper-Calvinism, or maybe they're thinking of that infamous cage phase, where new converts get a little overzealous with their theology. Okay, so let's officially start digging in. We're going to unpack these misconceptions one by one. We've seen the caricature, so now let's see how the actual history holds up against it. Now here's where things get really interesting, because this slide presents a total contradiction. The stereotype is all about cold intellectualism, right? But the source argues that if you look at the historical record, you see the exact opposite. Calvinism has actually been a huge engine for major missionary movements, incredible personal spiritual awakenings, and a really deep, heartfelt piety. That disconnect is what we're really exploring today. All right, so we've talked about what Calvinism supposedly isn't. Let's switch gears and talk about what it actually is. The core of the whole system is often boiled down to 5 key doctrines, which its supporters would much rather call the doctrines of grace. And you've almost certainly heard of the acronym people use to remember them, TULIP. It's a really handy way to keep them straight. It's worth noting, though, that the author of our source, Michael Horton, isn't a huge fan of a couple of these terms, and we'll see why in a sec. But for now, TULIP gives us a great framework to start with.
So here they are, all laid out. From total depravity all the way to perseverance of the saints, these 5 points really do form a tightly connected theological system. Each one kind of builds on the one before it. So let's break them down one by one and see how they all fit together.
First up, total depravity. And I know, that sounds pretty harsh, right? But the key thing to understand here is that it's about the reach of sin, not the degree. The doctrine isn't saying that every person is as absolutely evil as they could possibly be. What it's saying is that sin has touched and corrupted every part of us, our minds, our emotions, and most importantly, our will. So from this viewpoint, our will isn't really free to choose God, because it's held captive by sin. This idea is the foundation for everything else.
Okay, so if we're unable to choose God for ourselves, then how does anyone get saved? Well, that brings us to unconditional election. This doctrine's answer is that God is the one who does the choosing. His decision to save certain people is based completely on his own grace, not on any good deeds or faith that he saw in them ahead of time. The key word here is unconditional. It's not a reaction to anything we do. Next, we have particular redemption. Now, you might have heard this called limited atonement. A lot of people prefer particular redemption because it puts the focus on the purpose of Christ's death. The idea isn't to put a limit on the power of the atonement, it's to define its goal. In this view, Christ's death was powerful enough to save every single person, but it was specifically designed to guarantee the salvation of those God had already chosen. The fourth point is effectual grace, sometimes known as irresistible grace. And this flows logically, right? If God chooses people and Christ died specifically for them, how does that actually happen in their lives? This doctrine says that when the Holy Spirit calls one of the elect, that call always works. It doesn't just invite them, it actually creates a new heart that wants to believe. So in this way of thinking, faith isn't what causes you to be born again. Being born again is what causes you to have faith. And finally, we get to the grand finale, the capstone of the whole system, perseverance of the saints. So, if God chose you, Christ died for you, and the Spirit effectively called you, can you then lose your salvation? This doctrine says, nope. It means that the people God saves, He also keeps. Their ability to persevere in faith isn't up to their own strength. It's a gift from God who keeps them secure. Not a single one will be lost.
So there you have it, the 5 points. And they lead us smack into the middle of the great debate. The question that has defined this whole conversation for hundreds of years. Is salvation the work of one, or is it the work of two?
And wow, this slide just nails the core difference. Calvinism is monergistic. That comes from the Greek for one working. It basically says that God's grace and God's grace alone is what saves you. Arminianism, on the other hand, is synergistic, from the Greek for working together. This view says that salvation is a cooperative effort between God's grace and a person's free will. This right here, this is the fundamental divide.
Now, to keep things balanced, we have to look at the main pushback from the other side. This quote is from the foreword of our source, written by an Arminian theologian named Roger E. Olson. And his big concern is this: if God plans out everything, doesn't that logically mean he's also the author of sin and evil? He argues that this seriously undermines the goodness of God's character. It's a really powerful objection, and one you hear a lot.
Now, it's pretty easy to think that this all just started with one guy, John Calvin. But the truth is, these ideas have a way deeper history that goes back centuries before the Reformation even kicked off.
Yeah, the doctrines of grace didn't just appear out of thin air in the 1500s. Proponents trace this whole theological family tree all the way back to Augustine in the 4th century. It runs through the Protestant reformers like Martin Luther and, of course, John Calvin. It was officially spelled out at the Synod of Dort, championed by preachers like Charles Spurgeon, and it's even having a major comeback today in what people are calling the New Calvinism.
And speaking of Charles Spurgeon, man, the famous Baptist preacher did not pull any punches. For him, Calvinism was just a nickname for the Christian gospel itself, this idea of radical, unearned grace. He didn't mean that you had to be a Calvinist to be a Christian, but that these specific doctrines were the gospel in its purest form. So you might be thinking, okay, that's interesting history, but why are we still talking about a theological fight that's been going on for centuries? Does any of this actually matter outside of a seminary classroom? Well, it turns out it really, really does. Get this. This might actually surprise you. As recently as 2009, Time magazine listed the New Calvinism as number 3 on its list of 10 ideas changing the world right now. I mean, come on. Far from being some dusty old relic, this theology is making a huge, documented impact right now, in our world. And that's because, when you get right down to it, this isn't just an intellectual puzzle. This whole debate is about the most fundamental questions a person can ask. Who is God? How does salvation really work? What part do I play in it? These are not abstract ideas. They totally shape how a person lives out their faith every single day.
And that really leaves us with the big question, doesn't it? The one that's been underneath this whole explainer. Is this centuries-long argument over Calvinism just a debate for theologians locked away in an ivory tower? Or is it, like its supporters have always claimed, a debate about the very heart of the gospel itself? Definitely something to think about. Thanks for tuning in.